And that's the danger about going into some of these plea agreements without knowing the full picture or getting an opinion from an attorney who's used to dealing with these type of situations, like Jack. So, he's a factory worker. He works here in town. He's got a couple of kids, a relatively clean record. He has a bad night. So, he gets stopped by the sheriff. He's, leaving our local watering hole. And so he refuses the breath test, right? And then he allegedly refuses the chemical test, and he gets charged with an OWI. So the next morning, he's sitting in the jail, and they go to arraign him because he doesn't have his wallet on him or enough money to make bond. And the initial deal comes through to the initial attorney who's handling the arraignment that, hey, look, if they plead guilty today to the OWI, they're going to the prosecutor agrees to drop the refusal charge, which Heath is like, oh, okay, this is not a bad deal. They're going to give me a little bargain. I just take the OWI. It won't be a big deal. And what he doesn't realize is that by pleading that day, suddenly he's losing his entire chance to challenge the stop, any of the tests that were happening. And he gets a 1-year suspension potentially on the chemical test refusal, right? The implied chemical test consent refusal. And he's only got 14 days to put in a challenge to make that happen. So he thinks that he's getting something. And by pleading guilty, he's giving up all of his rights by doing it right off the bat. It looked like they were trying to give him some mercy, but in reality, they just sort of made his life a lot worse. And you also have to balance that against other scenarios that we've seen as well, where maybe you've got a guy who's got a couple of DUIs in his background, but the prosecutor hasn't done all their due diligence when they issued the initial charge. So they're just charging him with an OWI as a first offense, when in reality, he's probably eligible for a felony OWI third. And in that scenario, you probably want the guy to enter the plea as fast as you can before the prosecutor sees that this could potentially be a felony, because the guy's going to end up doing some time there. So you really need to work with an attorney who understands the plea process, and educate yourself a little bit as well. If you or somebody you care about find themselves being charged with a crime, and suddenly offers and plea deal discussions are starting to take shape. Hey folks, I'm Keith Stickley with the Stickley Law Firm here in downtown Hillsdale, Michigan. We're a full-service criminal defense law firm, and I like to make content pretty much every week discussing some of the most common issues that people in Michigan have when it comes to dealing with the criminal justice system. And I try to break down these issues into plain English so that you can understand. What I find is that an educated client often makes a much better client, and we get better outcomes if you know what's going on and you know what questions to ask of your attorney. And today we're going to be talking about the plea bargain process here in the state of Michigan, and really trying to get into the nitty-gritty of why prosecutors offer them, whether or not they're fair, when they're sort of traps, and what kind of attorney you really need in your corner, and what you need that attorney to consider as you're going through this process. And to start out with, we really need to address the issue, why does a prosecutor offer a plea deal in the first place, right? And here's something that a lot of people don't realize. Prosecutors don't offer deals because they like you. They offer deals because the entire Michigan court system runs on plea bargains, and there is not enough help and there is not enough court time to process everybody in some sort of a trial that gets charged with a crime. If every single defendant demanded a trial, the courts would literally shut down within a month or two. The dockets are that overloaded. So this system, especially in rural Michigan, is designed to move cases fast. And prosecutors, especially in smaller counties like Hillsdale, Branch, even Calhoun County, they've got every incentive to close files and keep their conviction rates high. Because you have to remember, a prosecutor is a politician. First and foremost, they are elected. They are partisan, right? And they like statistics so that they can go to their community and say, hey, I got a 90% conviction rate. And it makes things appear like they're trying to keep the community safe. And I'm not just here to just trash prosecutors, because many of them actually do want to keep their community safe. But the reality is they only have so much manpower and so much time as well. And sometimes certain convictions, quite frankly, generate a bunch of revenue for the community. And we also have to admit that sometimes a plea offer really is fair. Sometimes it saves a client's records, or it helps them qualify for a deferred sentence, or things like sobriety court, certain programs that genuinely can help them in the future kind of put the pieces of their life back together. But other times they offer a plea deal because in reality, maybe the state's case is really weak. Maybe they're not very confident of actually being able to get a conviction. And they'd rather guarantee getting a conviction to a lesser crime than risk losing everything at trial and having a quote unquote bad guy walk free on the streets after a case is over. With today's social and political climate, quite frankly, there's probably never been a more interesting time as a criminal defense attorney to hold jury trials and really take cases all the way to a trial. For the first time in a long time, we really are seeing juries who are much more sympathetic to defendants in certain types of cases. In other cases, we are seeing way less sympathy on the part of jurors and a willingness to convict. And that has to do with some of your CSE cases, some of your child abuse cases, and quite frankly, which sort of blows my mind, things like animal cruelty and dog-related cases, pet-related cases. Juries, by and large, I think if you look at the average, have been loving to convict on those things. And just kind of as an aside, sometimes I have to wonder if people really do care about animals more than humans. And to a certain extent, I guess they probably do. But we also need to acknowledge and talk about why some attorneys push plea deals way too fast. And this is where sometimes things get uncomfortable because some defense attorneys do really push clients hard to take pleas because it's easier for the attorney. And look, I like trials. Trials are actually fun. But trials take work. They take prep time. You have to develop cross-examination strategies. And frankly, trials take guts. You have to have an attorney who's willing to talk in front of people, who is willing to stand up for somebody who are sometimes accused of something really heinous, really terrible, and go to bat for them. At the very least, to simply protect their constitutional rights, because that's what this really is about. That's where the rubber meets the road as far as criminal defense goes. And if your lawyer is completely overloaded or is completely inexperienced or really just doesn't like to fight, is non-confrontational, this is your best option, just take it or leave it, that can seem like it comes really fast. And if some sort of plea could end up in some period of incarceration, especially, you don't necessarily want to rush into it, right? We can see why that is maybe not in your best interest. Now, it's important that you don't get me wrong here, right? Not every lawyer is like that, including a lot of public defenders and court-appointed attorneys. A lot of those folks fight really hard. In fact, harder than a lot of retained attorneys that we've seen on the record in the various courts throughout the state. But the flip side of this is sometimes taking a plea deal can really save your future. And this is why working with an attorney and taking counsel from an attorney that you trust is so vitally important, because you have to ask the questions. Why is this the best deal? Why do you think I should take the deal? And what happens if I don't take the deal? And what evidence do they really have against me? And how do you as an attorney think that a jury might interpret that information if we go all the way to a trial? Those are the important questions that you need to be asking your criminal defense attorney when you're dealing with a case. And if your lawyer can't answer those questions clearly, or worse, they seem annoyed that you're asking these questions, that's a red flag. That's how you know you don't have the right attorney that you're working with. Sometimes, in fact, many times, taking a plea really is in your best interest. Think about it. So an attorney gets a client who's been accused of something, and maybe the client did it, maybe the client didn't do it. But if there is a plea on the table that makes the entire case resolve itself and potentially go away, and will do it in a manner that has a minimal impact on that client, then maybe it's worth the risk to go into the plea, enter the plea, and see what happens at sentencing, especially if you're going to end up in something like probation or some sort of deferral or program. You have to be realistic and realize that sometimes gambling with a potential long sentence isn't really worth just seeing if a certain witness might show up, or just seeing if you have some other option, or you get really lucky with one juror who just decides that they don't like what the prosecutor has to offer. Because at the end of the day, it's the defendant who has to pay for that crime. And sometimes that involves actually sitting in a cage, in jail, or worse, in prison for a period of time. And an attorney can only make recommendations based upon what they believe is in your best interests, right? You as the client are the one that has to make the decision. The attorney cannot make the decision for you. And since I mentioned public defenders, I want to talk about the truth of public defenders in Michigan, if you will. Several years ago here in Michigan, there was major changes to Michigan's public defender system. That is basically the government provided or the government funded attorneys that act as public defenders here in Michigan. There's an entire group, sometimes referred to as the MIDC, the Michigan Indigent Defense Commission. What that is a government commission that sits up in Lansing that establishes certain standards that need to be complied with to act as a public defender here in the state of Michigan. Back in the day, judges used to appoint their friends or maybe sometimes even attorneys who weren't very good to represent people who couldn't afford an attorney just because they thought it would be, helping their friends out. Or maybe they would give them an attorney without a great reputation just because they figured, well, this guy will get convicted. We'll just give him this, we'll give him this public attorney. And the problem with these systems is it kind of created some nepotism. It was people appointing their friends and people appointing certain attorneys for various reasons other than simply protecting somebody's constitutional right, which is the main purpose of a public defender or any criminal defense attorney. This old system was totally set up and incentivized to have public defenders just blast cases through the system and try and make a couple of bucks on a volume basis without having to actually put in any real work in these cases. In Michigan, luckily, that's not really how it works anymore. Most public defenders, especially in rural Michigan, aren't actually county or state employees. They're actually independent private attorneys that you could hire off the street. And they get into contracts with the various court systems to be paid mostly on an hourly basis, believe it or not, to defend, just like you were a client walking into an attorney's office. And that has really pulled back the incentive for attorneys just to ram your cases through the system because, frankly, if a contract public defender who also has a private practice is working your case and takes it all the way to a trial, there's actually an incentive, there's a profit motive to take it all the way to a trial, because if they take it all the way to a trial, they make more money. So the system has tried to take out the profit motive of just trying to slam cases without doing any work on them through the system. Believe it or not, the attorneys will actually make less money doing that. Does that mean that it still doesn't happen? No. Just like in any profession, doctors, dentists, chiropractors, accountants, whatever. There are great practitioners, and there are people who probably should find a different line of work. What's most important is that you find one that you feel you can talk to, communicate, and trust, and is going to educate you and let you know what is going on with your case and what your options really are. It's up to you to take that information and really make a decision, because these decisions will affect your future, potentially the rest of your life. One thing in this regard that I always try to make very, very clear with all of my clients is I don't work well with clients who want me to tell them what they want to hear. Make it all rosy, pretend like it's all going to go away and everything's going to be fine. My personal working style is I want to look at what's the absolute worst case scenario. What are we really dealing with here, okay? And what really are our options? Because when we know how bad this thing, whatever the situation is, can really be, you can start working the case from the worst case scenario and working it towards the best case scenario to ensure that we get the best possible outcome. And sometimes that takes a lot of work, and it also takes an open and honest communication, because a lot of times I have to deliver information to clients that, one, they don't want to hear, or two, they don't necessarily agree with. But all an attorney really has to sell and to offer somebody is knowledge, trust, and their professional opinion. You don't want an attorney who's just promising you the world so that he can get a couple of $1,000 from you and then have you be upset sitting in a cage at the end of the day. Let's talk about when a plea is a really smart move. When should you take a plea? Because sometimes it's absolutely the right call. In fact, many times it's absolutely the right call. Sometimes you're accused of a crime and the evidence against you is strong. There might be videos, there might be witnesses, you might have made confessions, there might be lab reports that are really difficult to refute. And especially if you have a prior record, a plea deal can be a strategic move to protect you from something worse. I mentioned being a habitual offender. We should probably make a video on what exactly is habitual offender status, because a lot of people do have questions about that. You see, in the state of Michigan, if you're charged with a felony crime and you have any other felonies in your background, they can automatically enhance, in other words, make the maximum penalty far worse just because you had something in your past. Now, we could debate whether we think that this is fair all day long. I've got some pretty strong opinions on the matter. It's funny, you can't use prior acts, for the most part, with some limited exceptions, against you to try to prove your guilt in a new crime. In other words, oh yeah, back in the day he stole something, so he must have stole it this time. That's not allowed. That's against the rules of evidence. However, if you've been convicted of something, a felony, they can somehow miraculously enhance the sentence. If you get convicted of something completely differently. I don't really know how fair that is, to be honest with you. I've seen many times somebody as a young adult get convicted of some kind of a drug felony because they fell into addiction or something. And then many years later, they end up getting charged with some other felony, and the prosecutor wants to habitualize them, make the penalty far worse if they get convicted or potentially enter into some kind of a plea just because they had an addiction problem years and years before. And the two are completely unrelated. The prosecutor able to do this? Yes. Do I like it? No, but that's the reality that we're working within. These habitual enhancements can take something that would normally be a 2-year felony and turn them into a 15-year max felony. And if you're accused of a felony of 5 years or more, you can actually be sentenced all the way up to life in prison, depending on how many prior felonies you have on your record. These types of cases, a lot of times a plea might be one of the best ways, one of the most powerful ways to minimize risk and exposure to a lengthy jail or prison stay. You're not giving up, right? You're making a calculated move. And a good defense attorney is going to explain that clearly. They're not going to pressure you. They're going to walk you through the math and the risks that you take in potentially getting convicted and the reality of what the outcome might be. At the end of the day, every lawyer is different. Each client's different as well. Each case, each set of circumstances, completely different. And the worst attorneys in this business, honestly, and I see this happen sometimes, and it's borderline criminal to me, are the ones who promise you the moon. Don't worry, I'll get this case dismissed. This is nothing, or we'll beat this easily. And they try to get your money. And then a few months later, they're ghosting you or they're pressuring you to take the same plea deal that they swore that they'd avoid. Now, sometimes details change. Sometimes situations change. Sometimes offers are changed or they're retracted. But, the best attorneys, believe it or not, don't promise results. What they do promise is honesty, effort, and communication in dealing with your case. You should feel like your lawyer is fighting with you and trying to keep you out of a cage, not just trying to sell you something. Bottom line here is this: a plea deal is not automatically bad. In fact, it's somewhat of a necessary evil in our system as far as how it works. Going to trial also isn't automatically good. What really matters is whether the decision is made with strategy, with truth, and if you trust your attorney and the guidance that you're being given. If you're facing a plea offer in Michigan because you've been accused of a crime and you're not sure what to do, don't guess. Really talk to a lawyer, talk to a couple lawyers, ask for another opinion. Try to see and get comfortable with somebody who you believe is going to tell you the truth, even when it's what you don't want to hear. If you're facing a plea offer in Michigan because you or somebody you care about have been accused of a crime and you're not sure what to do, don't guess. Talk to that lawyer or get a second opinion. Attorneys are just like doctors. You want a lawyer who's going to tell you the truth, even if it's not what you want to hear. We're not here to give our clients good words. We're here, and I take a lot of pride here in working to keep my clients out of a cage. That's the number one priority. If you or somebody you care about is charged with a crime here in the state of Michigan, especially in the areas that we serve, like Hillsdale County, Branch County, Calhoun, Jackson, give my office a call here at the Stickley Law Firm. We're easy to find. You can find our contact information all over. We're going to bring you into our office or set up a telephone consultation or even come to see you at the jail if we have to. And we're going to give you a thorough case analysis and give you an honest, upfront assessment of what we think you're up against and what the possibilities might be. And if you're not a good fit, we'll try and point you in the direction of somebody that we think could help you out better. Until then, folks, stay safe, and we'll see you real soon.